Welcome. Let this be the hour you set everything down. There is no task waiting for you here, only an old road winding into the hills, and a story that moves slower than your breathing already has begun to slow. Let your shoulders sink into whatever is holding you. Tonight we walk toward the gold camps of the American West, and we walk without hurry. A cold morning in January of 1848 began it all. At a sawmill on the American River, in a valley called Coloma, water ran through a wooden channel built to power a mill wheel. Snow melt and gravel moved through that channel every day. Unremarkable, ordinary part of the plain work of building something. Nothing about the morning suggested it would be remembered. James Marshall was the man who noticed it. He was overseeing construction for John Sutter's sawmill when he caught sight of a small yellow flake caught in the mill race. He picked it up, turned it in his palm, and later described testing its weight and softness with his own hands. The flake was gold, and the river had likely been carrying such flakes for a very long time before anyone thought to look. Word travels slowly when it has to cross a continent by ship and by hoof. Newspapers on the East Coast printed the first accounts of California gold in the later months of 1848, and by the spring of 1849 the story had settled into the public mind as fact. Letters passed hand to hand in taverns and post offices. Maps of a place called California, once unfamiliar, were suddenly worth studying by candlelight. Somewhere near 300,000 people made their way toward California in those years. They came by wagon across the plains, by ship around the tip of South America, by mule train across the narrow crossing of Panama. Many carried little more than a shovel, a pan, and a change of clothes. The roads west filled with wheel ruts that are still visible today, pressed into hardened earth that has not forgotten the traffic. Coloma itself swelled almost overnight into a rough camp of tents and plank buildings. Stores selling flour and boots appeared where there had been only sawmill sheds. Within a few short years, though, the easy surface gold thinned out, and the miners who had crowded its banks packed their gear and moved on to richer ground elsewhere. Coloma settled back into quiet, its brief clamor already fading into memory even before the decade closed. Placerville carried a harsher name in its early years. Miners called it Hangtown, a name earned from the frequent lynchings carried out there by informal justice when courts and jails did not yet exist. A dry goods store still stands near the spot where the old hanging tree once grew. The rougher name eventually gave way to Placerville, a gentler word chosen as the town tried to leave its roughest years behind. At its height, Placerville held close to 10,000 people. Its main street ran thick with mule trains, freight wagons, and merchants selling picks, blankets, and salted meat to men bound for the diggings. Hotels rented cots by the hour to travelers passing through toward richer claims. The town became less a destination than a doorway, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere they hoped would be richer. Volcano, California, took shape that same year of 1848, tucked into a valley whose rounded shape reminded early prospectors of a crater. No volcano had ever erupted there. The name came only from the look of the land. Stone buildings and an old iron cannon, brought around the Horn by sea, still mark the settlement today. The valley kept its false name long after anyone remembered why it had been given. Shasta, California, earned itself a grander title, the Queen City of the Northern Mines. Its main street once held brick banks, hotels, and a courthouse serving traders and miners from the surrounding hills. Freight wagons loaded with supplies rolled through daily, bound for camps deeper in the mountains. The town's brick facades, built to resist fire, still stand today along that same street, hollow now, their upper floors long since fallen away. Let the breath find its own slow rhythm now, without any need to shape it. Notice the small pause after each exhale, that quiet hollow before the next breath begins. With every release, Let the shoulders drop a fraction further into whatever is holding you. There is no pace to keep, only this. Breathe out a little longer than you breathe in, and let that lengthening carry you further from the day. Columbia, California became one of the richest camps in the whole gold country. Its claims yielded more than $87 million in gold, drawn from gravel beds that once ran beneath the town's own streets. Miners eventually tunneled under buildings, chasing the same seams that had built them. The limestone bedrock beneath Columbia still bears the marks of those old diggings, pale scars in stone that outlasted the men who cut them. By 1945, Columbia had passed from working town into protected memory. The state of California named it a historic park, setting aside its wooden sidewalks and brick storefronts before they could crumble further. Restoration crews later repainted signs and shored up sagging porches, keeping the town looking much as it had a century before. Visitors now walk streets once crowded with mule teams, past false front buildings that never fell to fire or ruin. Angel's Camp holds a smaller, gentler kind of fame. It was there, in a saloon full of miners swapping stories, that a tale about a jumping frog took root. Mark Twain heard the story second-hand and later wrote it down, giving the sleepy mining camp a permanent place in American letters. The frog itself was never real, but the saloon and the men who told the tale over drinks were. Sonora, California, carried its name across a border. Miners from the Mexican state of Sonora settled there early, bringing mining knowledge that many newcomers lacked. They built some of the first successful diggings in the area, using techniques learned long before the rush began. Later arrivals often borrowed those same methods, even as tensions over claims grew between different groups of miners. Mokelumne Hill earned a grim reputation even among rough camps. For a time, it recorded one of the highest murder rates of the entire gold rush. Disputes over claims and cards often settled without any court in sight. The town's single main street saw more violence in a few short years than many towns saw in a lifetime. Little of that turmoil shows now in the quiet brick ruins left standing along the hillside. Downeyville took its name from a Scottish prospector named William Downey, who arrived with a small party of miners and staked an early claim along the river there. The settlement that grew around his camp kept his name long after he moved on to other diggings. Steep canyon walls hemmed the town in on every side, forcing its streets to follow the river's narrow curve. Even now, the town's shape still traces the same bend in the water. In 1851, Downeyville became the site of a hanging that later generations remembered uneasily. A woman known as Juanita was accused after a fatal stabbing and was lynched by a crowd before any formal trial could take place. Few written records from the time explain the full circumstances, and much of what happened that day remains disputed among historians. The event stood apart even in a place used to rough justice. LaPorte, California, grew around its usefulness rather than its gold. Sitting high in the northern mining district, it became a stagecoach hub where routes converged before pushing on toward smaller, harder-to-reach camps. Stables and way stations lined its main road, built to keep horses fed and coaches moving through heavy mountain snow. Freight and mail passed through LaPorte long after its own gold claims had thinned. Body, California, kept growing long after many camps had already gone quiet. By 1880, its population had swelled to nearly 10,000 people, drawn by rich veins discovered in the surrounding hills. Rows of wooden houses, saloons, and stores stretched across a windswept plateau, thin protection against the region's brutal winters. For a brief stretch of years, Body stood as one of the liveliest and most lawless towns in the entire American West. Body today looks almost the way it did the day its last residents walked away. The National Park Service calls this condition arrested decay, a policy of holding buildings exactly as found rather than restoring them. Roofs are patched only enough to stop collapse. Dust still covers store shelves, and canned goods sit behind glass windows clouded by decades of weather. Nothing is polished, nothing is rebuilt. The town simply stopped, and everyone since has agreed to leave it stopped. Feel your body growing heavier now, settling into whatever is beneath you. Start with your feet and let them turn to something soft and unmoving. Let that heaviness climb into your ankles, then your knees, sinking a little further with each breath you take. Your shoulders can drop their weight into the mattress, one side and then the other. Even your hands may feel too heavy to lift, resting exactly where they are. There is only this slow, sinking stillness, spreading upward, asking nothing of you at all. Body's standard mill kept running well after most of the surrounding town had gone still. Built to process ore from the standard consolidated mine, its stamps crushed rock day and night, extracting gold that had drawn the settlement into existence. Production continued until 1913, decades after the busiest years had passed. The mill's timber frame still stands on the hillside above the empty streets, its machinery rusted in place, marking the last working heartbeat of a town otherwise gone still. Watermen say Body first found gold in these hills in 1859, working alone through the short digging season before winter set in. He did not live to see what grew from his discovery. Caught in a blizzard while returning to camp, he died in the snow not far from his own claim. Miners who came after kept a version of his memory alive by giving the settlement his name, spelled with a slight variation that stuck for reasons no record fully explains. Calico rose not from gold, but from silver, discovered in the hills of the Mojave Desert in 1881. Word of the strike drew prospectors quickly, and within a few seasons the camp had grown into a proper town with stores, a post office, and several working mines. Its ore contained borax as well as silver, giving the district more than one reason to keep digging. For a stretch of years, wagons loaded with mineral rock left Calico almost daily. Walter Knott, the man behind Knott's Berry Farm, bought Calico in the 1950s and set about restoring its main street for visitors. Storefronts were repainted, boardwalks rebuilt, and a small railroad added to carry tourists through the old mining grounds. Knott based much of his restoration on historic photographs, aiming to keep the town recognizable rather than invented. Calico survives today as one of the few Gold Rush-era settlements deliberately kept alive rather than left to fade. Cerro Gordo sat high in the Inyo Mountains, its mines producing silver and lead ore rich enough to justify the difficulty of reaching it. Mule teams carried the heavy ore down steep switchback trails toward smelters and shipping points near Owens Lake. Winters brought deep snow that could close the mountain roads for weeks at a stretch. Despite the isolation, Cerro Gordo's output helped fund much of early Los Angeles's growth, its silver traveling far beyond the mountains that produced it. Panamint City began under unusual circumstances, founded by men hiding from the law in the folds of the Panamint Mountains. Outlaws reportedly discovered silver while avoiding capture, and word of the finds spread despite the settlement's remote and defensible location. A rough camp grew quickly along the narrow canyon, drawing miners willing to overlook its reputation for lawlessness. Flash floods eventually tore through the canyon, destroying much of the town and hastening its abandonment. Darwin, California, grew around silver deposits discovered in the surrounding hills during the 1870s. Smelters were built close to the mines, their smoke drifting over a scattering of wooden buildings set against dry, rocky slopes. For a time, Darwin supplied a meaningful share of the region's silver ore, shipped out by wagon toward larger processing centers. The town's population rose and fell with the ore itself, never quite matching the scale of its more famous neighbors. Randsburg arrived later than most, its gold discovered in 1895, after much of California's earlier rush had already faded into memory. The strike drew a fresh wave of prospectors to the Rand Mountains, reviving interest in gold mining decades after the original boom had ended. Wooden buildings rose quickly along its single main street, built with the same haste seen in earlier camps. Randsburg's boom proved that the desert still held surprises long after most assumed the easy gold was gone. Production across California's gold fields reached its height in the summer of '52, when miners pulled more gold from the earth than in any season before or after. Rivers were dammed, hillsides sluiced, and entire canyons reworked in search of the last easy metal. Assay offices in Sacramento and San Francisco logged record shipments that season. It marked the crest of a wave that had begun only 4 years earlier at Sutter's Mill. Within a few seasons, the easy gold began to run out. Surface deposits that had drawn thousands were largely exhausted by '55, and yields fell sharply across the diggings. Miners who had once panned rivers by hand turned to harder, costlier methods, or simply moved on. Camps that had thrived on quick discovery found themselves stripped of the resource that gave them purpose. Somewhere far off, a sound rises and fades, wind moving through an empty doorway, or perhaps a house settling into its own weight after a long day. It comes without warning and leaves the same way, asking nothing of you. Let your shoulders follow its example, rising, then letting go. There is no need to trace where the sound began. Only the drifting matters now. The slow give of breath-meeting stillness, over and over, until the sound is gone and sleep is closer than it was. Most camps born of the rush did not outlast a single decade. A settlement might swell to hundreds of buildings within months of a strike, only to empty again once the ore thinned. Storekeepers packed their shelves onto wagons and followed the miners elsewhere. Wooden frames were sometimes hauled whole to the next boom, leaving bare foundations where a town had stood. Nevada's Comstock lode broke the surface in '59, when prospectors working the eastern slope of the Sierra found silver ore far richer than anything California had offered. Word spread quickly among miners already weary of thinning placer claims. Many crossed the mountains east, trading gold pans for hard rock tools. The discovery opened a new chapter of mining, just as the older rush was winding down. Virginia City rose almost overnight as the center of that silver boom. Streets climbed the steep slope of Mount Davidson, lined with hotels, assay offices, and boarding houses built in haste. Freight wagons hauled ore down to mills and supplies back up in an unending exchange. Within a few short seasons, a barren hillside had become one of the busiest towns in the American West. Beneath Virginia City's streets ran a solution to one of its deepest problems. The Sutro Tunnel cut through miles of rock, drained scalding underground water, and let fresh air reach the deep shafts where miners worked in extreme heat. Its construction took years of grinding labor through solid stone. Without it, some of the richest ore bodies on the Comstock would have remained too dangerous to reach. At its peak, Virginia City held close to 25,000 residents, a population larger than many established eastern cities of its day. Theaters, churches, and a stock exchange operated alongside dozens of saloons. Newspapers like the Territorial Enterprise reported daily on mining fortunes, made and lost. For a brief stretch, this remote silver camp stood among the most influential towns in the country. Altogether, the Comstock lode yielded silver and gold worth more than $400 million, a fortune that reshaped mining across the West. The wealth funded new technology, deeper shafts, and grander buildings than California's earlier rush had ever produced. Investors in San Francisco built mansions on Comstock profits without ever visiting the mines themselves. The scale of that output remained unmatched by most other American silver districts for decades. Gold Hill grew up just below Virginia City, sharing the same rich ore body that ran beneath both towns. Its mills processed ore around the clock, their stamps pounding rock into powder day and night. Workers moved freely between the two settlements, which functioned almost as a single sprawling district. Though smaller than its neighbor, Gold Hills mines contributed heavily to the Comstock's overall wealth. A sudden strike in the desert north of Tonopah drew fortune seekers by the wagon load. Once word spread in 1902, prospectors staked claims across the barren hills, and within months a town of tents and rough lumber rose where nothing had stood before. The ore proved rich enough to justify rail lines and freight roads through country that offered little water and less shade. Goldfield took its name from the very ground that made it. By 1907, Goldfield had swelled past every other town in the state, its streets crowded with banks, newspapers, and a stock exchange trading claims worth fortunes on paper alone. Miners, gamblers, and promoters filled boarding houses built faster than lumber could properly dry. For a short stretch, this desert settlement outpaced even Reno in population and ambition. Its rise was as sudden as the vein that fed it. Among the buildings that outlasted the boom, one hotel still dominates the skyline of what remains. Built with tall arched windows and a grand facade meant to rival any city hotel, it opened just as Goldfield's fortunes were already beginning to fade. Its rooms once held guests drawn by mining wealth, though records of its later decades grow thin. Today, its empty windows look out over a town far smaller than the one that built it. Let warmth begin now in your hands, spreading slowly across your fingers and into your palms. Feel it rise gently through your wrists, up through your forearms, loosening whatever tightness has gathered there. Let that warmth travel into your shoulders next, easing them down and away from your ears. Allow it to settle into your chest, spreading wide and low, until your whole upper body feels warm and unhurried, resting easily against whatever holds you. South of Goldfield, a town built almost entirely from glass took shape in a place with little timber to spare. One resident stacked thousands of discarded liquor bottles necks inward to raise the walls of a small home that still stands today. The green and brown glass caught sunlight in ways no ordinary lumber could, giving the structure an odd shimmer even in decline. Rhyolite grew fast around it, drawing thousands within a short span of years. Before its sudden collapse in the 1920s, Rhyolite had electric lighting, running water, and a stock exchange handling mining shares from across the region. Concrete banks and a train depot suggested a future the town never reached. Investors pulled out almost as fast as they had arrived, once the richest ore played out. Within a few seasons, streets that once hummed with generators and telegraph wires stood largely empty. Northwest of these camps, a different strike drew crowds after prospectors uncovered silver-bearing rock in 1900. Tonopah grew around a mine named for a spring that had long supplied water to travelers crossing the desert. Freight wagons hauled ore south toward mills, while boarding houses filled with workers drawn by steady wages rather than sudden riches. Unlike some neighboring camps, Tonopah's mines kept producing for decades before finally slowing. Far to the west, a smaller camp called Candelaria faced a struggle few richer towns escaped so easily. Water had to be hauled long distances by wagon, and even then it arrived scarce and costly. Miners paid dearly for a single barrel meant to last through washing, cooking, and drinking alike. The dryness of the surrounding hills never eased, no matter how much silver came out of them. Across the state, silver's steady value began to falter after the financial panic that struck the country in 1893. Mines that had run profitably for decades suddenly found their ore worth far less than the cost of digging it out. Investors pulled back, and mills that once ran without pause slowed to occasional shifts. The silver rushes that had defined so much of the state's growth began, gradually, to wind down. Along a stretch of land where the border between two territories was never firmly settled, The town of Aurora rose directly on the disputed line. Buildings stood so close to the boundary that residents sometimes joked over which side collected their taxes. Surveyors eventually resolved the matter, placing Aurora within Nevada, though for a time nobody could say for certain. The confusion mattered little to the miners underground, who kept working regardless of which state claimed the ground above them. For a brief stretch of time, Aurora held more residents than Virginia City itself, its streets busier and its mills running at a faster clip than its famous neighbor. Newspapers of the day counted its population near 5,000, with two competing papers of its own reporting on court cases, mine yields, and new arrivals. Stone buildings rose quickly to house banks, assay offices, and a scattering of hotels. That advantage did not last, and within a decade the ore thinned and the crowds moved on. Belmont's courthouse still stands above the low hills of central Nevada, its brick walls and cupola outlasting nearly everything once built around it. Completed in the 1870s, it once housed county offices, a jail, and records now scattered or lost. Its clock tower no longer keeps time, but the structure remains sturdy enough to shelter visitors from the wind. Around it, the rest of the town has settled into low mounds of foundation stone and weathered timber. Berlin, Nevada rests inside a state park that shares its name with something far older than any mine. Fossilized ichthyosaurs, sea creatures from an age before mammals, lie preserved in nearby rock beds, giving the park its double purpose. The town itself kept its stamp mill, boarding houses, and machine shop largely intact, spared from scavengers by its remote canyon setting. Walking its single street, a visitor passes both a mining camp and a seabed frozen in stone. Lyosha earned a reputation few silver towns matched, its early years marked by gunfights, feuds, and a body count that outpaced its own cemetery's careful records. Accounts from the 1870s describe dozens of violent deaths before a single person died of natural causes there. Miners, gamblers, and claim jumpers crowded its saloons, and disputes over ore boundaries often ended without a courtroom. The town's Booth Hill, still visited today, holds markers for men whose names outlasted the reasons for their deaths. Somewhere past these hillsides, an ember still blows faintly in a long-cooled stove, its last thread of light fading by such small degrees that no one could say the exact moment it goes dark. Let your own thoughts dim in that same unhurried way. There is no need to hold on to the shape of the day behind you. Breath by breath, the light inside you can lower too, settling toward rest the way that last coal settles into ash. Colorado's own rush began not with gold panned quietly from a stream, but with a rumor that spread along wagon trails throughout 1858 and into the following year. Prospectors following reports of gold near Pikes Peak turned a slogan into a migration, painting wagons with the words "Pikes Peak or Bust." Many who arrived found little and turned back disappointed within months. Others pushed further into the mountains, where richer strikes waited beyond the first disappointing creeks. Central City grew so rich so fast that people began calling it the richest square mile on earth, a claim repeated in newspapers across the country. Gold veins beneath the town supported dozens of mines, along with opera houses, hotels, and brick storefronts built to look permanent. Miners from Cornwall, Germany, and Ireland filled its boarding houses, bringing their own customs into the thin mountain air. For a time, Central City's wealth rivaled that of far larger eastern cities. Central City's face block still shows the brickwork its builders raised after a fire swept through the town's early wooden structures. Merchants rebuilt with fired brick and stone facades, believing permanence would follow prosperity. Ornate cornices and tall windows gave the block a formal air, meant to reassure investors and travelers alike. Many of those same buildings still stand, their brick faces holding the shape of a boom that outlasted its own gold. Just below Central City, The smaller town of Black Hawk grew around the machinery its neighbor needed, but had no room to house: stamp mills, smelters, and ore. Processing works lined its narrow canyon, their noise and smoke a constant companion to daily life. Workers moved between the two towns freely, one built for ore and offices, the other for crushing and smelting. Black Hawk's industrial rhythm kept both places running long after the easy gold had thinned. Higher into the Rockies, Georgetown rose through the 1860s as silver replaced gold as the region's chief draw. Its streets filled with Victorian storefronts, a firehouse with a tall tower, and homes built by mine owners eager to display their new fortunes. Narrow mountain roads connected it to smaller camps scattered through the surrounding peaks. Georgetown's silver wealth gave it a polish that many rougher camps never managed to acquire. Leadville sits higher than almost any town its size in the country, more than 10,000 feet above sea level, where the air thins and the winters arrive early. Snow could bury the streets from October through May, yet the town filled anyway with miners chasing silver instead of gold. Wooden sidewalks kept boots out of the mud, and smoke from smelters hung low against the surrounding peaks. Even the mules brought up from lower valleys needed weeks to adjust to the altitude. Silver poured out of Leadville's ground in amounts no other Colorado town would match. Its mines fed a fortune that built opera houses, banks, and the main street lined with brick facades meant to rival Denver's. Investors from the east sent engineers to study its ore veins, while local millionaires built mansions on streets still half frozen through spring. For a stretch of years, Leadville's silver output outpaced every rival camp in the state. Cripple Creek's fortune began in 1890, when gold was found in volcanic rock beneath a quiet cattle pasture. Word spread through Colorado within months, and prospectors abandoned older camps to stake claims on the hillsides above the new town. Tents gave way to wooden buildings, then to brick, as the population climbed past what the narrow roads could easily hold. Freight wagons and later trains struggled to keep pace with the ore coming down from the hills. Over the following decades, Cripple Creek's mines yielded roughly $500 million in gold, a sum that reshaped the surrounding district entirely. Underground shafts reached deep into the volcanic rock, following veins that miners mapped by lamplight and instinct. Company offices, stamp mills, and rail spurs spread across the hillsides, turning what had been open range into an industrial landscape. The wealth drawn from that ground helped finance buildings and fortunes far beyond the district itself. Nearby, the town of Victor grew so thick with mine works that residents took to calling it the City of Mines. Headframes rose within sight of front porches, and the ground beneath the streets was honeycombed with tunnels following the same rich veins as Cripple Creek. Workers walked to their shifts past company stores and modest wooden houses built close to the mines that employed them. Victor's identity was inseparable from the machinery that surrounded it on every side. Let your jaw soften now, the way a hand slowly opens when it forgets what it was holding. Let your eyelids grow heavy, heavier than they've felt all day, until keeping them open feels like more effort than it's worth. Behind closed eyes, there is only a soft, unlit space, wide and quiet, asking nothing of you. Let your face rest there, in that dim stillness, with nothing to arrange and nowhere for your attention to travel. Just the dark and the slow rhythm of breath moving through it. Creed's growth, after its 1890 silver strike, happened faster than the surrounding canyon could comfortably hold. Buildings rose along a narrow gorge, some built directly against the rock walls, with the main street barely wide enough for 2 wagons to pass. Newcomers arrived by the trainload, drawn by reports of rich ore and easy fortune. For a brief season, Creed's population and its ambitions outgrew the tight stone walls that framed it. St. Elmo still stands today as one of Colorado's most complete ghost towns, its wooden storefronts leaning gently but largely intact along a quiet mountain street. Founded during a smaller silver boom, the town never grew large, which may be part of why so much of it survived. Weathered false fronts and empty windows face a road that once carried freight wagons and stagecoaches. Snow still settles on its roofs each winter, much as it did when the town was full. Silverton took its name plainly from the ore that built it, and the town thrived first on silver, later on gold pulled from the same mountain veins. Surrounded by steep San Juan peaks, it depended on narrow-gauge rail to move ore out and supplies in through winters that could close the passes for weeks. Saloons and boarding houses lined its main street, serving miners who worked shafts cut high into the slopes above town. Silverton outlasted many of its neighbors by adapting from one metal to another as the ground demanded. Higher still, Animas Forks sits above 11,000 feet, where the San Juan Mountains close in on all sides and summer lasts only a handful of weeks. Miners there endured some of the harshest winters of any camp in Colorado, with snowdrifts said to bury entire buildings some years. A scattering of wooden structures remains, including a house with bay windows that once looked strange so far from any city. Wind moves through the empty frames now, the only traffic left on its rutted road. A miner working a Colorado creek reportedly panned his first flecks of gold using nothing but his own drinking cup, and the discovery gave Tin Cup its name. The camp grew around that small, almost domestic detail, with cabins and a main street rising near the gulch where the find was made. Tin Cup never became one of the state's largest towns, but its name endured, a plain reminder of how modest a beginning could be. Records from those early days are thin, but the Tin Cup itself became part of local memory. Ashcroft had grown on the promise of silver, its street lined with hotels and a smelter built to handle the ore, pulled from nearby peaks. When the silver market collapsed in 1893, the town's fortunes fell within months rather than years. Miners left for other camps, storefronts emptied, and the smelter fires went cold. What had briefly been a town of several thousand became, within a short span, a scattering of quiet buildings under the Elk Mountains. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act had required the federal government to buy large quantities of silver each month, propping up prices that Colorado's mines depended upon. Its repeal in 1893 removed that support almost overnight, and silver prices fell sharply across the country. Towns built entirely around silver mining, from Aspen to Creede to Ashcroft, felt the effects immediately as mines closed and payrolls stopped. The collapse reshaped Colorado's mining map, pushing many camps toward gold instead, where the market still held. Reaching Colorado's remote mining camps meant building railroads that could climb grades and curves too tight for standard track. Engineers laid narrow-gauge lines through canyons and over passes, their rails set closer together to allow sharper turns on mountain slopes. These small trains carried ore down to smelters and hauled lumber, food, and mail back up to towns like Silverton and Creede. Portions of that narrow-gauge track still run today, following the same winding routes cut more than a century ago. Prospectors moving into Idaho's mountains in the early 1860s found gold along tributaries of the Clearwater River, drawing the territory's first wave of miners. Camps sprang up quickly in canyons where the rivers cut through dense forest, far from any established road. Word of the strikes spread along trails already used by fur traders and missionaries, pulling newcomers north from California and east from Oregon. Within a few short seasons, what had been quiet river country became a scattered network of mining settlements. Idaho City rose so quickly on its gold strikes that for a time it held more residents than Seattle or Portland, making it the largest city in the entire Pacific Northwest. Wooden buildings crowded close together along streets crossing steep hillsides, and the town supported banks, breweries, and newspapers within its first few years. Freight wagons carried goods in from Boise and beyond, keeping the isolated boomtown supplied through long mountain winters. Its rapid rise showed how quickly a gold strike could outpace even the coastal cities of its day. Let the breath lead for a while now, in through the nose, slow and unhurried, and out through parted lips a little longer than it came in. Each exhale can stretch a bit further than the last, like a wagon wheel losing its momentum on a level road. There is no need to control it, only to notice it, the quiet rise and the longer fall. Let this rhythm carry you, breath after breath, further from the day and closer to rest. Historians estimate that Idaho City's mines eventually produced somewhere near $250 million in gold, an extraordinary sum drawn from a stretch of forested hills. Much of it came from placer deposits worked along nearby creeks, sifted from gravel by hand and later by hydraulic hose. The wealth built the town's brick buildings and drew merchants, but it also drained the ground of the very resource that had created it. When the placers thinned, Idaho City's growth slowed as surely as it had once surged. Silver City sits high in Idaho's Owyhee Mountains, its original wooden buildings still standing along boardwalks that once kept miners' boots out of the mud. No paved roads reach the town even now, and its remoteness is part of why so much of it survived intact. Hotels, a schoolhouse, and a church remain much as they were built, weathered but upright against the mountain air. Walking its boardwalks today follows the same worn path that miners and merchants once took between shops and saloons. Silver City's isolation made one detail unexpected. The town had telegraph service before many larger cities in the region did. Wires were strung across the mountains specifically to keep mine owners informed of silver prices and shipment schedules from distant markets. That connection let a remote camp track the outside economy almost as quickly as cities on the coast. For a town reached only by rough mountain trail, it kept pace with the wider world in ways its size alone would never suggest. Grasshopper Creek drew fortune seekers into Montana's high plains after word spread of a strike there in the year 1862. Word of the find traveled fast through mining camps in Idaho and Colorado, pulling wagons and pack mules northward across open country. Prospectors staked claims along the creek bed, panning gravel that had rested undisturbed since the glaciers withdrew. Within months, a rough settlement of tents and log cabins rose where sagebrush had grown alone for centuries. Bannack rose from that creekside camp to become the first seat of territorial government in Montana. Log buildings that had housed miners soon held clerks and lawmakers instead, their desks lit by whale oil lamps against the drafts of unfinished walls. Streets that carried ore wagons carried political business as well, however briefly. The town's rise from mining claim to capital happened within a single winter, a pace almost unthinkable by older standards of settlement. Bannack survives today inside the boundaries of Bannack State Park, its main street left largely as the miners abandoned it. Wooden storefronts, a schoolhouse, and a courthouse still stand along the road, their paint long since faded to bare gray timber. Visitors can walk past the old Hotel Meade and the Masonic Lodge, both preserved rather than restored to look new. The state maintains the buildings without erasing the marks that decades of weather have left upon them. Virginia City took Bannack's place as territorial capital in the year 1865, only 3 years after the first strike. Richer deposits nearby had drawn the bulk of the territory's population away from Bannack's thinning creek. Government offices moved with the people, following gold rather than the other way around. For a time, the town held both the machinery of law and the noise of an active mining district within the same few blocks. Alder Gulch, the ravine beside Virginia City, gave up more than $100 million in gold before its richest years passed. Miners worked the gulch with sluice boxes and later with dredges, turning the narrow valley floor into a maze of tailings and ditches. The wealth pulled merchants, printers, and even a theater troupe into a town that had begun as little more than a claim marker on a hillside. Few gulches in the American West matched Alder's output relative to its modest size. Nevada City sits just beside Virginia City, a smaller camp that has been kept much as it stood during the boom. Its buildings were gathered and preserved together. Some moved there from other failing camps to save them from collapse. A narrow-gauge rail line once ran between the two towns, carrying passengers over the short distance separating them. Walking from one town to the other today follows nearly the same path miners once walked between Claim and Courthouse. Montana vigilantes carried out hangings in both Bannack and Virginia City during years when courts and sheriffs held little practical authority. Groups of citizens organized themselves to try and punish men accused of robbery and murder along the mining roads. Their actions were recorded in later accounts and local histories, though the full number of those hanged was never precisely settled. The events left behind markers and gallows sites that remain part of both towns' preserved histories today. Let the weight of the bodies settle now, beginning at the crown of the head and moving downward like sand filling a jar. Feel the shoulders grow heavy first, sinking into whatever is beneath them, then the arms, then the chest, then the hips, each part releasing its hold, a little more than the one before. By the time this heaviness reaches the feet, the whole body may feel pressed gently into stillness, held there by nothing but its own weight. Garnet stands among the most complete ghost towns left in Montana, its log cabins and general store still gathered along a hillside road. The town never grew large, staying a modest camp of a few hundred residents even at its height. Because it was never rebuilt or expanded after its decline, its buildings retain the simple shapes miners first raised them in. Snow still buries the empty street each winter, much as it did when the last families left. Elkhorn keeps two of its original wooden storefronts, standing along a quiet stretch of Montana Mountain Road. Fraternity Hall and Gillian Hall rise above the surrounding grass, their false fronts and second-story windows largely unchanged since the mining years ended. The rest of the town has faded into scattered foundations and leaning fences, leaving these two structures as the clearest remaining witness to what once stood there. Cattle now graze where miners' wagons once passed. Word of gold in the Black Hills, spread after a military expedition led by George Custer, passed through the region in 1874. Custer's men reported traces of gold along the streams while surveying land promised by treaty to the Lakota people. Newspapers picked up the reports, and prospectors began drifting toward the Dakota Territory within months. The discovery set off a rush that would reshape the region's future and its long-standing conflicts over land. Deadwood rose from a bare gulch into a crowded settlement within months of the 1876 gold strike. Log cabins and canvas tents crowded the narrow valley floor, packed so tightly that streets barely existed between them. Saloons, hardware stores, and boarding houses opened one after another as newcomers poured in from failed camps elsewhere. Wagon trains and pack mules brought supplies over rough trails, since no railroad yet reached the town. Wild Bill Hickok was shot inside Deadwood's Nuttall and Mann's saloon in the summer of 1876, only weeks after arriving in town. He was seated at a card table when the shooting occurred, struck from behind by a man named Jack McCall. The killing shocked the young camp and quickly became part of frontier legend, retold in newspapers across the country. Hickok was buried in Deadwood's Mount Moriah Cemetery, where his grave remains a visited sight today. Lead grew beside Deadwood as home to the Homestake Mine, one of the largest gold operations ever developed in North America. Deep shafts descended thousands of feet beneath the surrounding hills, supporting a workforce that built an entire company town around the mine's needs. Homes, churches, and a hospital rose under the mine's sponsorship, giving lead a stability, many mining camps never achieved. Ore trains and hoist towers dominated the skyline for generations. The home state mine kept operating without interruption from 1876 until its closure in the year 2002. Across those long decades, it produced more gold than almost any other single mine in American history. Its underground workings eventually reached depths greater than most mines anywhere in the world. When mining finally ended, the site was repurposed for scientific research. Its deep chambers later used to study particles from deep space. Custer became the first town founded during the Black Hills Gold Rush, established near the site of the expedition that had first reported gold in the region. Prospectors gathered there before richer strikes drew them onward toward Deadwood and Lead. The town's early boom faded quickly once attention shifted north, leaving Custer smaller than the camps it had helped inspire. Its early buildings still mark the opening chapter of the region's mining history. Rockerville relied heavily on hydraulic mining, using pressurized water cannons to strip hillsides in search of buried gold. Wooden flumes carried water for miles from mountain streams to feed the powerful nozzles used in the operation. The technique moved enormous amounts of earth quickly, exposing gold that simpler methods could never have reached. Scarred hillsides and abandoned flume lines still mark the landscape around the old town site. Arizona's mining fortunes were never built on gold and silver alone, since copper deposits ran deep beneath much of the territory's mountains. Towns rose around copper veins just as readily as around precious metal strikes, drawing smelting companies and rail lines into remote desert country. Copper often outlasted the gold and silver booms that first drew settlers to a region. Some Arizona towns shifted entirely from one metal to another as their mines matured. A low hum drifts through the house tonight, rising faintly and fading again like breath moving through old walls. It might be wind finding a gap in the eaves, or simply the house settling into its own weight. Either way, it comes and goes without needing attention, the way distant sound often does at this hour. Let it pass through the room unexamined, arriving softly and leaving just as easily, taking nothing of yours with it. Tombstone grew rapidly after a silver discovery in 1877 drew prospectors into the dry hills of southeastern Arizona. The find was significant, enough to support a full town within a short span, complete with hotels, newspapers, and a busy commercial district. Its name, chosen half in jest by its founder, became fitting as violence and mining accidents added to its growing cemetery. Tombstone's silver wealth made it one of the most prosperous towns in the territory during its peak years. Boot Hill Cemetery holds the graves tied to Tombstone's most famous street fight, a brief exchange near the OK Corral that left 3 men dead. Wooden markers, many hand-painted, list names and causes of death with plain frontier bluntness. Rows of graves belong to miners, gamblers, and lawmen alike, buried side by side without much distinction. Visitors today walk gravel paths between weathered headboards that have outlasted the town's boom by more than a century. Jerome rises in tears along a steep Arizona hillside, its buildings stacked above rich copper deposits discovered in the 1880s. Streets curve back on themselves as they climb, following the slope rather than any grid. Miners carved tunnels beneath the town itself, so deep that parts of the main street later slid downhill from the ground shifting below. Its perch above the valley gave Jerome sweeping views that mining crews rarely paused to admire. Jerome's fortunes swung sharply once copper prices collapsed after the mine slowed in the mid-20th century. Its population fell so fast, that by the 1950s it earned recognition as the largest ghost town in the country. Empty storefronts and boarded hotels lined streets that had once bustled with smelter workers and shopkeepers. Only later did artists and preservationists return, giving the hillside town a second, quieter chapter. Chloride sits among Arizona's low desert hills as one of the state's oldest mining camps, still holding residents today. Founded in the 1860s, it survived long after larger silver towns emptied out around it. Weathered adobe walls and a handful of original storefronts remain scattered along its main road. Small mining operations continued there well into the 20th century, keeping a thread of daily life unbroken across generations. Bulcher City took shape around the mine, discovered by Henry Wickenburg, a German immigrant who found gold-bearing quartz southwest of present-day Phoenix. The mine grew into one of Arizona's richest gold producers, drawing hundreds of workers into a cluster of adobe buildings on the open desert floor. A mess hall, assay office, and bunkhouses formed the town's core, with little else to soften the surrounding heat. Wickenburg's find gave his name to the nearby settlement that still bears it today. Gillett grew as a processing town for ore hauled down from the Tip-Top mine in the hills above. Mills and smelters lined its narrow valley floor, handling rock brought in by wagon over rough desert tracks. The settlement never held more than a modest population, existing mainly to serve the mine's steady output. Its buildings faded once richer ore ran thin, leaving stone foundations scattered across the valley. Congress supported one of Arizona's steadier gold mines, operating for decades after many nearby camps had already emptied. Its underground workings ran deep beneath the surrounding hills, employing crews long after the initial rush had faded elsewhere. A fire in 1938 tore through the mine's surface structures, ending operations there for good. What remained afterward were foundations and tailings, quietly folding back into the desert landscape. New Mexico's own gold rush gathered around Elizabethtown, following a strike made in 1866 near the Moreno Valley. Prospectors flooded into the high mountain basin, drawn by placer gold found along nearby creeks. The town grew fast enough to support hotels, saloons, and a busy main street within its first years. Snow came early and heavy at that elevation, shaping the rhythm of mining seasons around short, workable summers. Elizabethtown holds the distinction of being the first incorporated town in the New Mexico Territory, a status granted as its population swelled. Records from its early council meetings describe efforts to organize water rights and mining claims amid rapid growth. And the town's incorporation gave it formal streets, an assay office, and a measure of order rare among mining camps of its size. Within a generation, though, the gold thinned, and much of that early structure fell quiet. Warmth can begin now in the hands, spreading slowly across the palms and into each finger. Let that warmth climb into the wrists, then along the forearms, loosening whatever tension gathered there through the day. It moves next through the shoulders, easing them down and away from the ears. From there, it settles into the chest, spreading wide and low, filling the ribs with a heaviness that feels like rest itself arriving. White oaks rose in the White Mountains of southern New Mexico, its gold veins drawing steady crews through the final decades of the 1800s. Brick buildings and a school gave the town an air of permanence rare among mining camps. Its fortunes turned when railroad surveyors chose a different route, leaving White Oaks without the rail link its merchants had counted on. By the early 1900s, businesses shuttered one after another as residents drifted toward towns the trains actually served. Mogollon sat deep in a narrow canyon of New Mexico's mountains, its silver and gold veins pulling miners into one of the territory's more isolated camps. Apache-raiding parties struck the settlement and its supply routes more than once during its early boom years, forcing miners to fortify buildings and travel in armed groups. Mining continued despite the danger, with new strikes drawing fresh crews even after losses. The canyon's steep walls left little room for the town to grow beyond a single crowded main street. Shakespeare grew from an earlier camp called Ralston, renamed after silver claims briefly rivaled gold discoveries nearby. Unlike most former mining towns, Shakespeare never became public property. A single family purchased the site decades after its decline and has maintained its adobe buildings, wooden stagecoach stop, and general store as a private museum. Visitors today walk the same worn floorboards on scheduled tours, the town preserved less by government protection than by one family's private, ongoing effort. Kelly began as a silver camp in the Magdalena Mountains, its early wealth drawn from rich lead-silver ore near the surface. As those veins thinned, mining companies shifted operations toward zinc deposits found deeper in the same hills. The transition kept Kelly's mines running for several more decades after most silver camps nearby had already emptied. Eventually, the zinc ore thinned as well, and the settlement's tramways and headframes fell still against the mountain slope. Terlingua's mines drew workers not for gold or silver but for mercury, extracted from cinnabar ore found in the rugged hills of far west Texas. Rows of brick furnaces once lined the hillsides, roasting ore to release the liquid metal inside. Workers lived in small stone and adobe homes clustered near the mine works, many of them Mexican laborers who formed the backbone of the operation. The mercury market's collapse after the mid-1900s left Terlingua's furnaces cold and its homes empty. Ruby Creek, tucked into the rugged Cascade Mountains of Washington state, drew a modest gold rush during the 1890s. Prospectors hauled supplies over steep, forested passes into a valley far from any established road. The remote terrain limited the scale of mining compared to camps farther south, and few permanent structures took hold. Snowfall came early in those mountains, closing trails for months and shortening every working season to a narrow summer window. Oregon's own gold rush centered on the Blue Mountains during the 1860s, where prospectors found placer deposits scattered through creek beds near what became Baker City and Auburn. Auburn briefly swelled to thousands of residents, complete with hotels and a busy main street built almost overnight. Miners worked the gravel bars through short mountain summers, hauling equipment along rough wagon roads carved through pine forest. Within a decade, most of the surface gold had been recovered, and Auburn's crowded streets emptied nearly as fast as they had filled. Susanville sat near the edge of California's mining country, close enough to the Sierra foothills to draw prospectors, but far enough east to mark a kind of frontier boundary. Nearby camps, scattered through the surrounding high desert country, worked smaller, less consistent gold deposits than those farther west. Ranching and timber eventually outlasted mining as the region's main livelihood. The camps that once dotted these outer reaches left little behind beyond scattered foundations and old wagon roads fading into sagebrush. Utah's gold rush towns included Mercure, tucked into the Eau Claire Mountains not far from the Great Salt Lake. Cyanide processing methods allowed miners there to extract gold from low-grade ore that earlier techniques could not profitably work. The town grew to include a hospital, an opera house, and several thousand residents drawn by steady employment rather than a sudden strike. Its position within a narrow mountain canyon left the settlement crowded and its buildings closely packed along a single winding street. Mercure burned once in 1896, destroying most of its wooden buildings, and residents rebuilt using brick and stone in hopes of preventing another loss. A second fire swept through in 1913, proving no less destructive than the first. Mining continued afterward for a time, but declining ore quality and falling gold prices eventually ended operations altogether. The site was largely dismantled, and today little remains beyond scattered foundations and mine tailings across the mountainside. A single lantern flame settles low in its glass, no longer flickering, just a steady point of amber light. The wick has burned for hours, and the oil beneath it grows thin, patient in its own dimming way. Outside a window, unseen, the last cart wheels of the day have gone still on some forgotten street. Let your own thoughts settle the same way, small and steady, needing nothing more from this night. Alaska's own gold rush took shape in 1880, when prospectors found promising quartz veins near a channel of water that would later carry Juneau's name. Joe Juneau and Richard Harris are the names most often credited with the discovery, staking claims along Gold Creek. Word spread slowly at first, carried by boat rather than rail, since no roads yet reached this stretch of the Alaskan coast. Within a few years, a scattered mining camp had taken hold on the narrow strip of land between mountain and sea. Juneau grew largest around the Treadwell mine, a sprawling complex of stamp mills and bunkhouses built on Douglas Island just across the channel. The mine employed thousands of workers at its peak, drawn from Europe, Asia, and across the American West. Its mills operated day and night, crushing ore in a rhythm that residents learned to sleep through rather than around. For a time, Treadwell stood among the largest gold processing operations anywhere in the world. The Treadwell complex met its end without warning one night in 1917, when seawater broke through weakened mine workings and flooded the tunnels below. Much of the surface structure collapsed into the resulting cave-in, swallowed into the sea almost entirely within hours. No lives were lost in the collapse itself, though the mine's productive years ended there. Today, divers still find broken timbers and rusted machinery resting on the seafloor beneath Gastineau Channel. Farther north, the Klondike Gold Rush began with a discovery made in August of 1896, when George Carmack, Skookum Jim Mason, and Kate Carmack found gold along Rabbit Creek in Canada's Yukon Territory. The creek was soon renamed Bonanza Creek, a name that proved fitting. News of the strike did not reach the outside world until the following summer, when ships loaded with gold arrived in Seattle and San Francisco. What followed was one of the largest and fastest mass migrations in North American history. Dawson City rose along the Yukon River almost overnight, swelling past 30,000 residents by the summer of 1898. Wooden storefronts, dance halls, and boarding houses crowded a town site that had been wilderness only 2 years before. Steamboats crowded the riverbank, unloading goods for a population that briefly rivaled some established American cities. Winters there brought bitter cold and long darkness, yet the town's saloons and theaters kept running through it. Skagway served as the main gateway for those bound for the Klondike goldfields, a rough port town at the head of a narrow Alaskan inlet. Stampers disembarked there by the thousands, hauling supplies toward mountain passes that led into Canadian territory. The town filled quickly with outfitters, hotels, and conmen, most notably the gambler Soapy Smith, who ran much of Skagway's underworld before his death in a gunfight in 1898. For many travelers, Skagway offered their last taste of settled civilization before the wilderness ahead. Dia sat only a few miles from Skagway, competing fiercely for the Stampeders' business as the starting point of the Chilkoot Trail. The trail climbed steeply through mountain passes, a punishing route that thousands chose despite its difficulty. Dia briefly held its own against its rival, with its own wharves, hotels, and outfitting shops crowding the tidal flats. When a rail line bypassed the town in favor of the White Pass route, Dia's fortunes faded within a single season. The White Pass and Yukon Route Railway, completed in 1900, finally ended the need for stampers to carry their own supplies over mountain trails on foot. Its narrow-gauge tracks climbed from Skagway through White Pass into the Canadian interior, a feat of engineering built by workers blasting through solid rock. Freight that once took weeks to haul by hand now traveled in hours by rail car. The railway drew business away from Dia entirely, and the foot trails that had carried so many stampeders slowly emptied of travelers. Nome's own rush began in 1899, when prospectors discovered gold lying directly in the beach sands along the Bering Sea coast. Word spread fast among miners already disappointed by the Klondike's played-out claims, and thousands redirected themselves north toward this new find. Unlike inland strikes, Nome's gold required no digging through frozen ground, only sifting sand within reach of the tide. Within a single season, a tent city stretched for miles along the shoreline. Formal claims meant little on Nome's crowded shoreline, where thousands worked the sand without deeds or surveyors. Anyone with a shovel and a rocker box could try their luck between the tide lines. Miners divided the beach into informal sections by mutual agreement, moving their tools with the rising and falling water. Disputes were common, but so was a rough cooperation born of shared, unclaimable ground. Let your jaw loosen now, the way an old door settles when no one is pulling at its handle. Feel the weight of your eyelids, heavier than they were a moment ago, no longer interested in staying open. Behind your closed eyes, there is only a soft, dim field, unmarked and unhurried. Let your face forget what it was holding. There is only the dark, warm, and near, asking nothing of you at all. Copper, not gold, drew builders to Kennecott in the Alaskan wilderness. Prospectors had noticed a green stain on a distant mountainside, a signal of rich ore beneath the surface. By the early 1900s, a mining company had raised a full industrial town there, far from any road, reachable only by rail line and river. The site produced some of the richest copper ore ever found in North America. Kennecott's mill buildings still stand today, tall wooden structures stepping down the mountainside in weathered red paint. The National Park Service now oversees the site within Rangel St. Elias National Park, the largest protected wilderness in the country. Visitors walk past rusted machinery, empty bunkhouses, and the old hospital building, all left much as the miners abandoned them. The mountain air has kept the wood remarkably intact despite the decades of snow and silence. By 1899, the great rush to the Klondike had mostly run its course. Miners who had endured the Chilkoot Trail and Dawson City's crowded streets heard of Nome's easier beach gold and packed their gear once more. Boats leaving the Yukon River carried away much of the population that had built Dawson into a boomtown only a season before. What had seemed permanent proved, once again, to be only temporary. Placer deposits, the loose gold found in stream beds and gravel, ran thin wherever miners worked them hard enough. Once the easy gravel was sifted and the creek beds gave up their last flakes, many camps had no reason left to exist. Storekeepers packed their shelves onto wagons, following rumors of richer ground elsewhere. A town that had held thousands could empty within a single dry season, leaving only foundations and fence posts behind. Water cannons blasted whole hillsides apart in the search for buried gold, a method called hydraulic mining. Miners aimed powerful jets of water at mountainsides, washing tons of earth through sluices to catch the flecks of ore within. Rivers downstream filled with mud and gravel, burying farmland and clogging channels for miles. Forests near many camps disappeared entirely, stripped for timber to fuel the pumps and flumes. Farmers downstream finally won their case in 1884, when a federal judge issued what came to be called the Sawyer decision. It barred hydraulic miners from dumping debris into California's rivers, ending an industry that had reshaped entire valleys. Mining companies that had blasted mountains for over a decade shut down their water cannons almost overnight. Fields that had drowned in mining silt slowly began to clear again, though the scars in the hillsides remained visible for generations. Ditches and flumes, built by Chinese laborers, still traced the hillsides above many old camps. Skilled at moving water across difficult terrain, Chinese miners constructed elaborate systems to carry streams to distant claims, some stretching for miles through rock and timber. Their work often outlasted the towns it served, engineering that required little upkeep to endure. Traces of these channels remain visible today, quiet evidence of labor rarely credited in the era's own accounts. Rock Springs, Wyoming, saw one of the era's darkest episodes in 1885, when a mob of white miners drove out and killed Chinese laborers in a coal mining dispute. Many Chinese residents lost their homes and possessions in the violence, fleeing on foot toward the nearest rail line. Federal troops eventually restored order, though no one was ever convicted for the deaths. The episode reflected a broader pattern of hostility Chinese immigrants faced across many western mining towns. Railroads decided which towns lived and which faded, and many camps discovered this too late. When a new line chose a different route through the mountains, the towns left behind lost their freight, their mail, and soon their people. Stagecoach roads that once carried thousands fell silent within a season. Merchants packed their shelves onto wagons and followed the tracks to wherever the rails had gone instead. Wood frame buildings burned with terrible ease, and whole towns could vanish between dusk and dawn. Coal stoves, kerosene lamps, and dry timber made a single spark dangerous in camps built without fire codes or water systems. Wind through narrow canyon streets often spread flames from one rooftop to the next before anyone could organize a bucket line. Some towns rebuilt after such nights more than once, only to burn again years later. Let your breath find its own unhurried rhythm now, rising and settling like something that has always known how to rest. Each exhale can travel a little farther than the one before it, drifting out past the edges of the room. There is no need to shape it or count it. Just let it loosen, wave after wave, until your whole body seems to breathe on its own, patient and slow, like tidewater easing back from a quiet shore. Virginia City faced its harshest trial in 1875 when a fire swept through the heart of the Comstock district. The blaze consumed hundreds of buildings, including mills, hotels, and much of the business quarter, in a matter of hours. Firefighters worked through smoke, choked streets with little more than hand pumps, and hauled water. The town rebuilt within months, driven by silvers still waiting underground. Brick became the answer many towns turned to after losing everything to flame. Merchants who had rebuilt in wood twice or more began choosing fired brick and iron shutters instead. Streets that once burned, block by block, gained facades that could survive a spark. Traces of those brick fronts still stand in places like Shasta and Columbia, outlasting the wooden neighbors that once stood beside them. A camp could swell from empty ground to thousands of residents faster than any planner could track. Word of a strike traveled by rider, telegraph, or newspaper, and within weeks tents crowded every open space near the diggings. Some camps counted more people after a single winter than many towns hold today. Streets were laid out in haste, often following the shape of a creek rather than any surveyor's line. Saloons and gambling halls anchored nearly every boomtown's main street, standing beside dance halls and boarding houses that served the same restless crowd. These districts offered the only entertainment many miners knew after long days underground or in the gravel: piano music, card tables, and cheap whiskey-filled rooms lit by oil lamps late into the night. Such districts often outlasted the mines themselves, closing only when the last customers finally moved on. Where no sheriff or judge had yet arrived, miners often organized their own committees to keep order. These vigilance groups investigated thefts, claim disputes, and violence, sometimes holding trials in tents or open fields. Their judgments carried real weight, backed by the agreement of the camp, rather than any distant government. Towns like Bannack and Virginia City in Montana became known for such committees during their earliest, least governed years. Preservation became the quiet answer to decades of theft and decay. States began designating certain abandoned camps as parks, hiring caretakers to guard buildings that had stood unguarded for generations. Fences, locked doors, and ranger patrols replaced the open access that once let anyone wander in and carry pieces away. Body, Columbia, and Bannack all found new purpose this way, protected rather than simply forgotten. Bannack still gathers a crowd each summer for a Living History Day, when volunteers dress in period clothing and open the old buildings to visitors. Blacksmiths work forges that once served real miners, and demonstrations of panning and baking bring the town's routines back for an afternoon. Wagons roll down the same dirt street where Montana's first territorial government once met. For a few hours each year, the ghost town breathes again before returning to its long quiet. Unprotected sites have suffered under the hands of collectors and thieves for generations. Bottles, tools, and even door hardware have vanished from buildings left without locks or watchmen. Whole cabins have been stripped of their nails and hinges by visitors seeking souvenirs. What survives today often represents only a fraction of what once stood, the rest carried away piece by piece over the decades. Fences of a different kind protect certain camps, not made of wood or wire, but of ownership. Private ranchers and mining heirs still hold deeds to land where old buildings stand, closing the gates to strangers. Visitors, driving long dirt roads, sometimes find only locked cattle gates and posted signs. These towns rest beyond public reach, their streets and storefronts, known mostly through old photographs and family memory. Beneath the surface of certain districts, old tailings still hold traces of uranium and other minerals left behind by early ore processing. Wind and rain have carried these fine gray sands into nearby creeks and soil for over a century. Some sites near Colorado and Utah camps required federal cleanup crews decades after the last miner left. Warning signs now stand where children once played among the mine dumps. Let the weight of the day settle into the mattress beneath you, beginning with your feet. Feel them grow heavy, sinking into the sheets, as though the earth itself were drawing them down. That same heaviness moves upward now, through your ankles and calves, resting fully into the bed below. Let your hips grow still, your shoulders grow still, until your whole body feels held, unmoving, safe in the dark. Old shafts still open into the earth near many former camps, some hidden beneath brush or collapsed timber. Rangers and land managers post fencing and warning signs where the ground gives way to darkness below. Falls into these forgotten workings have injured hikers who wandered off marked trails. Even after a century of silence, the tunnels beneath these hills remain unstable and largely unmapped. Federal stewardship now covers a number of former mining districts across the West. Rangers patrol grounds once left to scavengers and weather, stabilizing walls and clearing debris from collapsing structures. Interpretive signs now stand where miners once walked without record or notice. The National Park Service oversees pieces of this scattered history, from Alaska's Kennecott to smaller camps tucked into desert canyons. The body carries a formal title now, recognized by the federal government as a National Historic Landmark. That designation confirms what visitors already sensed walking its dusty street, that few places preserve so much of the era so completely. Roughly 200 buildings still stand, their interiors left as they were found, dishes on tables and papers on desks. The landmark status guarantees a measure of federal protection against the decay and theft other towns endured. Not every ghost town rebuilt itself from memory alone. Calico, once stripped nearly bare after its silver mines closed, was reconstructed in the 1950s largely for visitors rather than residents. Businessman Walter Knott funded much of the restoration, rebuilding storefronts and boardwalks to resemble the original camp. Tourists today walk streets that mix genuine remnants with careful recreation, a town brought back less as history and more as attraction. Cameras and lasers now do what pencils and notebooks once could not. Teams of researchers scan decaying buildings inch by inch, recording every warped beam and leaning wall in precise digital detail. These three-dimensional models allow structures too fragile for visitors to be studied and preserved long after the wood itself gives way. A cabin photographed today might exist only in data within another generation. Tree rings hidden inside old ceiling beams and door frames still speak if researchers know how to read them. Dendrochronology matches the pattern of growth rings in mining town timber against known climate records, revealing the exact year a tree was felled for lumber. This method has confirmed construction dates once known only through fading county records or faded newspaper mentions. Wood cut for a saloon roof still remembers the season it fell. Metal detecting carries a ban across many of these protected grounds now. Federal and state managers restrict the practice, aware that a single sweep with a coil can pull artifacts from soil that took generations to settle. A belt buckle, a coin, a rusted nail all carry information once removed from context. Rangers post the rule plainly at trailheads, and most visitors leave their detectors in the truck. Historic gunfights return to life each summer in towns built for silver and gold. Actors in period coats stage the old rivalries on the very streets where such disputes once happened, revolvers loaded with blanks, crowds gathered along worn boardwalks. Tombstone hosts perhaps the most famous of these reenactments, drawing visitors eager to see a version of the past performed rather than read. The dust kicked up by boots settles the same way it always did. Warmer, drier seasons now press against wood that has stood for over a century. Climate scientists note longer fire seasons across the western states, and dead timber inside old mining towns burns with little resistance. Buildings that survived floods, storms, and decades of neglect face a newer kind of threat, one carried on wind rather than neglect. Preservation groups watch weather forecasts the way miners once watched the price of silver. Flames came close to body itself during the wildfires of 2020. Crews working the surrounding hills held a fire line near the historic town site, protecting the leaning cabins and rusted machinery inside. Smoke drifted over the empty streets for days before the danger passed. No structures were lost that season, though the closeness of the fire reminded caretakers how fragile arrested decay can be against a changing climate. Somewhere beyond the window, a sound rises and fades without asking to be understood. Maybe it is wind finding a gap in old boards, maybe a house easing its weight into the ground below. It comes close, then draws back, like breath moving through a room too big to fill. There is no need to trace where it began. Let it pass overhead, low and even, while your shoulders sink further into whatever is holding you tonight. Money raised in small amounts from many strangers now holds up walls that once seemed destined to fall. Preservation groups turn to online campaigns, asking visitors and history enthusiasts alike for modest donations toward lumber, nails, and skilled labor. A leaning storefront in one town, a collapsing roof in another, each finds new support one contribution at a time. Crowdfunding has become an ordinary tool for extraordinary patience, propping up what mining money once built and abandoned. A handful of these towns did not stay empty forever. New residents arrived decades after the mines closed, drawn by cheap land, quiet surroundings, or the simple appeal of a weathered main street. Populations that had fallen to a few dozen crept upward again, slowly reshaping streets once left to wind and dust. These revivals rarely restored the old industry, but they returned something the towns had lost, the sound of daily life. Jerome, Arizona, once known for its copper rather than gold, found new purpose long after the mines went silent. Artists began arriving in the 1960s and 70s, drawn by cheap rents and the town's steep, sun-worn streets clinging to the hillside. Old buildings that once housed miners became studios, galleries, and small shops. Jerome's population, once numbering in the thousands, settled into a smaller creative community that still occupies the same weathered buildings today. Virginia City, Nevada, no longer answers to the price of silver. The mines that once drew 25,000 people fell silent long ago, but wooden boardwalks and false-front saloons still line the main street, kept standing for visitors rather than miners. Tourists ride antique trains, browse old storefronts, and walk past the Sutro Tunnel's distant entrance. The town survives now on curiosity rather than ore. Its economy shifted from underground to above-ground history. Satellite positioning has found camps that maps forgot decades ago. Researchers carrying handheld devices follow faint wagon ruts and scattered tin cans into brush-covered gullies, marking coordinates where cabins once stood. Sites listed only in old county ledgers, or not listed at all, now appear as precise points on modern survey maps. Forgotten places, some no larger than a few foundations, are being quietly returned to the historical record one coordinate at a time. Aircraft flying low over old mining districts now carry laser instruments that map the ground beneath tall grass and fallen timber. The light pulses pass through brush and shadow, returning outlines of building pads long since buried under a century of soil. Foundations invisible from the ground appear on computer screens as faint rectangles, the traced edges of homes, stores, and stamp mills. Places once known only by name are being redrawn from data gathered far above the earth. County budgets in former mining regions now depend in part on visitors drawn to weathered ruins. Small museums, guided walks, and gift shops built from old assay offices bring modest but steady income to towns that never fully recovered from the mine's closing. Motels, diners, and gas stations along rural highways rely on travelers seeking a glimpse of the old frontier. Ore no longer moves through these valleys, but curiosity does, and it pays the bills a little longer. Filmmakers now send small drones humming over collapsed roofs and empty window frames, gathering footage once impossible without a helicopter's expense. The aerial views trace crumbling walls against open desert or forested ridgelines, showing the full shape of towns that visitors on foot can only see in fragments. Documentaries built from this footage reach audiences who will never walk the actual ground. The old camps, forgotten by most, now drift across screens in distant living rooms. Wind and rain have never stopped their work on these old buildings. Wooden beams warp further each winter, and adobe walls soften year by year under sun and occasional storm. Rising temperatures and drier seasons in parts of the West have quickened the decay of timber, already brittle with age. What survives today is not guaranteed to survive another lifetime, and every photograph taken now becomes, a little more, a record of something already vanishing. Across deserts, mountains, and river valleys, these towns still stand for the same sudden hope that once carried thousands west overnight. A single strike could fill a valley with lights and voices, and its ending could empty that same valley within a season. Body, Rhyolite, Bannack, Dawson, and so many smaller camps remain scattered reminders of how quickly fortune rose and fell across this land. The gold is long gone, the miners longer gone still, but the shape of their hope remains standing in wood and stone. The same moon that once lit their rutted roads still rises tonight over rivers that have not stopped flowing, over hills that have not stopped settling, over you, wherever you are resting now. People 100 years ago closed their eyes to the same kind of stillness you are closing yours to now, worn out, hopeful human. Let the old towns rest in their silver light, and let yourself rest too. Good night.